All right, let me pick up the end of this because I want to move on to 26 and it's important, but I don't want to skip Jacob. And the Jacob story is in 26 to 34. Let's just quickly look 25, 26 to 34. Afterward, his brother came forth with his hand holding on to Esau's heel, so his name was called Yaakov, trickster or heel catcher. Isaac, Yitzhak or laughter, was 60 years old when he gave birth to them. When the boys grew up, Esau became a skillful hunter, man of the field. Jacob was a peaceful man living in the tents. And now you tell the story of the stew and the birthright again. But this time you stop telling it from the standpoint of the hungry, hairy one, but rather from the interior decorator chef one. And this perspective is, there are three ways Jacob shows himself in the first story to be a manipulator. First of all, he knew from his birth his destiny. That privilege was assumed very early in his life. He felt he wanted a better position in the family and he was going to get it. Who would think, honestly, if your brother walked in hungry, who would think, yeah, before I give you the sandwich, give me your birthright? I mean, who would think that way? A manipulator. A manipulator is a person who sees what they can get of every situation. That's what they're looking at. How can I angle this to get what I want? The second thing I can see about him is he lived in a comparative world where he, in the tent, was seen as a good guy. And his brother out there was an outsider. But with his mom, he hung out together and was always, oh, you cook so well, you're a good guy. With his dad, he never quite measured up. And that marked his life. The third thing I want you to know is that he was more clever than he was caring. And that's one of the signs of a manipulator. They're more clever than caring. He was ready for his hungry brother. He had already prepared something to eat. He's a very clever man. He's figured out the angles. Now, the thing is, all of 25 was supposed to be a life learning laboratory. I want to drop into 26, and I want to tell you that there are two stories in chapter 26. The first 7 verses is story number 1. Both stories are of Isaac. And by the way, Isaac gets very few verses in Scripture, so the details about Isaac's life are at a premium because there's very few verses. Okay? And what I want you to see is the first 7 verses or so will give you story number 1, where Isaac will end up in fear and living in fear, and fear will motivate him to make the wrong choices. Then, story number 2 is the second half of 26, and at the end, he will end up blessed, and he will end up in faith. Let me put it this way. Chapter 26, 2 stories. You can end in fear or end in faith, and these will be opposite one another. This is a motif you're going to see many times. You're going to see it in David's life at least twice, but it's a very important story. So, 2 stories. One ends in failure and insecurity. The other one ends in faith and security. Okay? Let's take a look at them. Here's the pattern. A problem leaves him feeling vulnerable, leaves him looking for direction, leaves him acting in fear, leaves him facing consequences. Look at verse 1. There was a famine in the land. There's your problem. So I would probably mark problem. Beside the previous famine that had occurred in the days of Abraham. So Isaac went to Gerar, to Avimelech, king of the Philistines. You have to remember, 13 chapters in Genesis are devoted to Abraham. 2.5 are devoted to Isaac. Okay? So Isaac's story is very purposeful. Did you notice that in the verse, Moses recorded the detail, this is going to look so much like another story I told you about Abraham, but it's a different time. Isaac is so much like his father's response that Moses has to make the note as the writer. This isn't the same. I'm not mixed up between this and Abraham. This is a different story, but it's exactly the same. I got to tell you, there's an old saying, like father, like son. One of the things we do is we become very much like our parents. In some ways, I promise you're going to look in the mirror and you're going to see more of your mom or dad as time goes on. And I promise you that some things are going to come out of your mouth and you're going to go, oh, I'm channeling my mother. You're going to go, how did I? And as it comes out of your mouth, you're going to hear that. You're going to poke your eye out with that thing. Somehow it's going to come out of your mouth and you're going to go, my mother used to say that all the time. Can't believe I just said that. See, we as parents know that if we keep saying it over and over, eventually it will mark your brain and we will leave a tattoo in there. Now here's the thing. Moses included a mention that was in fact a repeat performance. I want you to go to, just mark next to 26:1, 20 verse 1. Because Genesis 20 verse 1 was the daddy's lie. Remember that he went to Gerar in 20 verse 1? Abraham journeyed there and said, Sarah is my what? Sister. Why? Because he was afraid. One of the things I want you to understand is that often the second generation deals with a problem the same way the first one did. You know where I see this? Alcoholics. Almost the vast majority of alcoholics I counsel through addiction had parents that were alcoholics. You can go, well, maybe it's genetic, it's a disease. That probably plays into it. The genes probably are somewhere involved in it, but I think the coping mechanism is also involved in it. They see that as a way to cope. Now, stop for a second and jump to the end of the story. God knows how to get something done, and do you remember what happened with Abraham? What happened when Abraham lied about Sarah?
The nation was punished, that Abimelech was punished for it, and all the wombs were
closed. The whole place was mourning and everybody was upset. The women were all angry and grumbling at the men. The men were unhappy, and they were more than happy to ask Abraham to leave and never come back. What happens is God steps in, and do you remember how they found out what the problem was? God interjected the story. I want you to look at 26:2 now. The Lord appeared to him and said, this is the Lord interjecting again. So the problem existed in verse 1, and the Lord stepping in verse 2. Do not go down to Egypt, stay in the land of which I will tell you. Sojourn in this land, and I will be with you and bless you. For to you and to your descendants I will give all these lands, and I will establish the oath which I swore to your father Abraham. I will multiply your descendants as the stars of heaven, and will give your descendants all these lands, and by your descendants all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because Abraham obeyed me and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, my laws. So Isaac lived in Gerar. In spite of the past and the promises, Isaac wanted to respond in fear, and fear leads to sinful choices. His first reaction in the story is to do what about his wife's identity? Look at verse 7. When the men of the place asked about his wife, he said, she is my sister, for he was afraid. Circle afraid, that's the heart of the passage. He was afraid to say, my wife, thinking the men of this place might kill me on account of Rebekah, for she is beautiful. In trying to preserve peace, he actually caused the men to mistrust him, causing more trouble, causing more tension. He lied because he thought he could protect himself, but the lie became the point at which there was a problem for him. Go down to verse 10 for a minute. Abimelech said, what is this you have done to us? One of the people might easily have lain with your wife, and you would have brought guilt upon us. You could have brought us a world of problems. Do you understand that every time Abraham's family shows up and goes walking into Gerar or walking into Abimelech's life, and this is now a different prince than the one in the previous story because it's years later, we assume, but every time Abraham's family shows up, they're a bunch of liars. This, by the way, is one of the ways I know that the scriptures are God's story. You would not tell a story about your history saying, by the way, we were a bunch of evil liars, and every time we went to our neighbors, we lied to them and bad things happened. This is not the way people tell their home warm stories about their past. Now, in the first 10 verses, you saw in the first 7 verses the lie, and then the consequence in 10. What have you done to us? But I want you to stop for a second and say, wait a second. Isaac faced consequences, and God worked through the consequences. One of the things I want you to know is, you're going to say when you read Isaac's story, he should have known better. You're going to mutter to yourself and say, why is this guy doing exactly what his dad did that was wrong? Here's the thing. With God, things don't turn out the same. With God, things don't turn out the way you deserve them to turn out. You can do everything wrong and God can fix it. So, you just have to remember, God's in the redemption business. That's what he does. He doesn't save the good, he saves the bad. If you are saved, it is because you have figured out you are depraved. Okay? The difference between, you know, all the lost people in your life think they're good people. The vast majority of them think they have enough good to get into heaven. It's the saved person who goes, yeah, I don't have enough good to get in heaven. I need Jesus because I can't get in. It's the only way I can get in. So here's the thing. It says, for lost people, they come to the conclusion that God is their salvation. Can God bless me when I face such strong opposition from my own past and my own choices? That's the story here. The story is, when you've made bad decisions, can God fix it? So I want you to go to 8 and 9. I skipped over 8 and 9. I went from 7 to 10. So 26, 8 and 9. God stewards Isaac through the failure. It says, it came about when he had been there a long time that Abimelech, king of the Philistines, looked out through a window and saw, and behold, Isaac was caressing his wife Rebekah. Then Abimelech called Isaac and said, behold, certainly she is your wife. How then did you say she is my sister? And Isaac said, because I said I might die on account of her. I love the fact that when confronted, he told the truth. I don't love the fact that he told a lie getting into the situation, but when he was caught, he said, yes, here's the problem. I was afraid. And verse 11 says, Abimelech charged all the people, he who touches this man or his wife will surely be put to death. Now here's the thing. God blessed him in spite of his behavior. If you get anything out of this story, here's what I want you to get out of it. God didn't fix Isaac's life because Isaac did right. God fixed Isaac's life because God had a plan for Isaac's life. And if he fixes the bumbling mistakes you make and the defiant rebellion that you do, it won't be because you're so good. It will be because he has a plan for your life. I could go back and tell you, I won't tell you the stories, but I can go back and tell you stories of things that I was engaged in that had they come out the way I was planning, they would have ruined my life, and there's no way I'd be sitting here today doing this. The thing is, God thwarted my plans to do wrong. I had some pretty good plans to do wrong several times, and God really made me inept at getting them done. And all I'm telling you is sometimes the biggest protection God needs to give you is against yourself. You're thinking, well, I got to watch out for the world. No, a lot of times you just got to watch out for the flesh. Because you have enough to destroy your own life without anybody else being involved. Does everybody agree with that? I used to believe when a marriage fell apart that it always took two. Now I know that one person can screw it up all by themselves. You can come home married to Snow White and be a jerk and ruin the whole thing. It doesn't take two. It takes one person. You don't even have to get up out of your chair to sin deeply and be unusable to God. Now the interesting thing is that in losing ground, the guy finds faith. Look at 15. Now there's a second problem. Do you know before that there was a problem? What was the first problem? No. The first problem that he faced.
Oh, the famine?
Famine, which caused him to go into a position he didn't want to be in, which caused him out of fear to tell a lie, which then brought about consequence. I want to give you a second problem. He faces another problem. It's in verse 15. All the wells which his father's servant had dug in the days of Abraham his father, the Philistines stopped up by filling them with earth. Okay, now the problem is not just a famine problem, but it's all oriented the same way, a supply problem. Something happens in the supply chain. And he traveled, and that put him in a position of vulnerability. He travels under a foreign prince. It says, Abimelech said to Isaac, go away from us, for you are too powerful for us. Isaac departed from there and camped in the valley of Gerar and settled there. So Isaac chose to act. I want you to understand something that's going on here. Maybe somebody can read from 18 through... Somebody read 18 to, I'm looking for, let's say 20. Nice and loud.
Then Isaac dug again the wells of water which had been dug in the days of his father Abram, for the Philistines had stopped them up after the death of Abraham, and he gave them the same names which his father had given them. But when Isaac's servants dug in the valley and found there a well of flowing water, the herdsmen of Gerar quarreled with the herdsmen of Isaac, saying, the water is ours. So he named the well Izet, because they contended with them.
One more verse.
Oh. Then they dug another well, and they quarreled over it too. So he named it Sitnah.
Okay, let me give you two definitions here that you want to put in your text. One of them is asek, that's A-Y-S-E-K, is spelled E-S-E-K. Asek is the word that means wrestling or contention. Sitna is the feminine form of Satan or Satan. Sitna means quarreling or accusation. Satan means accuser. Satan's name is accuser. That's a title. So I want you to see one of these means contention, one of these means accusation. Being one of God's people doesn't exempt you from the problems of the rest of the world is going to face. And Christians often grow discouraged when they encounter serious problems, not because the problems of themselves, but it's not that they're so overwhelming, but because they expected a trouble-free life. So you have to stop and look at 26 and step away as a believer and go, wait a minute, if I'm a believer, that doesn't mean my life isn't going to have problems. It's going to have as many problems as everybody else. One of the things that you have to do is you have to step back and you go, okay, sometimes God calls us to re-dig the wells of those who went before us. That is exactly what we're doing in Ocala. We're redigging a well. In other words, a group of people dug a well, a church was built there, and for some reason it got filled up. It just didn't go. And we're out there redigging what somebody else has dug already. We want to do this in Lakeland. We want to do this in other places. Sometimes, look, it's never nearly as cool to redig a well. I mean, it's very cool to be the person who accomplishes the well the first time. We dug this well. But going out there and go, we cleaned this well, doesn't have that same ring. But it's just as important. Sometimes communities that have been won for Christ have to be re-won. Every generation has to be re-won. We are one generation from extinction all the time as Christians. Because yesterday's believers don't save today's lost. You got to go today to look at today's lost and bring them today's message. Now, if you keep going, he's working until he found a place to have peace. Go all the way down to verse 22 for a second. He moved away from there and he dug another well, and they did not quarrel over it. So he named it Rehovot. And he said, at last the Lord has made room for us, and we will be fruitful in the land. Then he went up from there to Beersheba. Rehov is the word for street. In fact, if you live in Israel, when you give your address, Rehov Polotsky was where I used to live. One of my office was on Rehov Lincoln. Because of Lincoln, Lincoln, they use all the letters. So on Rehov Lincoln is where I used to work. Rehov then is a broad place or a street. Rehovot is a very broad place, a place with lots of room, a roomy place. And here's the thing. God steps into the situation, and then God speaks again. Look at verse 24, because God spoke again. The Lord appeared to him the same night and said, I am the God of your father Abraham. Do not fear, for I am with you. I will bless you. I will multiply your descendants for the sake of my servant Abraham. So he built an altar there, and he called upon the name of the Lord, and he pitched his tent there, and there Isaac's servants dug a well. Do you see the position? Worship first, well second. He goes in place after place looking to meet his need. When God meets his need, he stops in worship. And the next place he goes, it's worship first and well second. Because he's starting to understand. It was a time following a misunderstanding. It was a time of exhaustion and tension. And he saw God step in for him. Can you walk away from chapter 26 with a sense of two stories? One of them where he has to tell a lie because he's living in fear, and another one where he keeps trying, keeps working, sees God open the door, doesn't live in fear, and God leaves him with an open space. One of the things I know about him is that he built an altar because he had a thankful heart for what God did. And I would mark next to where he built the altar a thankful heart, because I think that's a necessary component. I also note that after he had a thankful heart, he pitched a tent because he had a settled heart. I think he felt settled down. And I think that he dug the next well with an anticipating heart. He looked out and he said, God's going to settle us here. So he goes with a thankful, settled, and anticipating heart. I just want you to remember that the deeper the well, the more it's going to cost you. The deeper the well, the clearer the water, but the deeper the well, the harder it is to get there. The deeper the well, the higher the sacrifice. Isaac's men dug a deep well, and because of that, they could live a long time in that place. Let me throw this out to you. You kick it around, see how it works for you. I suggest to you that the story is a story of 4 wells. See if you can pick up the 4 wells. The first one is the well of contention. What's it called? Asek. The second one is the well of accusation. What's that one? Sitna. The third one is the well of growing or growth spurts. What's that one? Rehavot. And the fourth one is the destination. What is it? What's the fourth well? Look for the word, the Hebrew word for well. Beersheba. The well of swearing, and that's the well of the covenant. And if you follow the story, what he's doing is he's bringing you through Isaac's life through a series of wells. He's helping you to understand there was contention and there was accusation, then there was a growth spurt, then God finally settled him down and gave him back what his father and the covenant was. I will give you a land. That's the way the story is told. Now, here's what's weird. You'd miss the story. The story is actually told through the wells. The reason he tells you the name of something is it has something to do with the story. So whenever you see somebody interject, and the name of the place was this, ask, what does that have to do? Because it's probably a hinge for the story. Yeah.
Is there a specific reason he uses wells to tell the story?
Yeah. If you're living in the desert, you don't build fences. You don't build buildings. Tents move. What do you leave behind? Wells. It's the only thing you leave behind. And that's what I think is kind of cool is you have to sort of be desert-minded to pick up on the story, but I think the story of Isaac is really a story of how God left something behind. I think one of the neatest parts about Isaac's story is though it's very compact and doesn't give you a lot of details, what you see is these 4 wells, and by the way, you'll see them in your own life. There's going to be times when you go through struggle, times when you go through accusations, time when there's growth spurts, and times when you really settle down and see God's promise for your life. And that's going to be the kind of the rotation of Isaac.